The sound of glass shattering jolted me awake. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, the dim moonlight filtering through my curtains, casting eerie shadows across my room. My first instinct was to check on my younger brother, Caleb, who was sleeping in the next room. But as I swung my legs off the bed, a creak from the hallway floorboards froze me in place. Someone was in the house. I tiptoed toward the door, my breath shallow, and peeked through the crack. The shadow of a figure moved down the hall toward the living room. My mother and stepfather. Greg weren't home. They had gone to a late-night charity event and wouldn't be back until early morning. That left Caleb and me alone. Or so I had thought. Well, grabbing my phone, I texted Greg, "Someone is in the house." My hands trembled as I sent the message. No response. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I opened the door quietly and stepped into the hallway. Caleb's door was still closed, and I prayed he hadn't woken up. As I moved closer to the living room, I spotted the figure. A man dressed in black, rummaging through drawers in the kitchen. My heart pounded louder than I thought possible. Suddenly, Greg's voice boomed from the entryway. "What the hell are you doing here?" The intruder turned, startled. Greg, in his tuxedo from the event, stood holding a baseball bat, his jaw tight with fury. The man bolted for the back door, and Greg chased after him, leaving me standing there in shock. When he returned minutes later, panting and frustrated, he locked the door behind him. "He's gone," Greg said, noticing me for the first time. "Are you okay, Nora?" I nodded. My voice caught in my throat. His eyes searched mine for a moment before he stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch sent a ripple of calm through my chaotic thoughts. "You should have called the police," he said, his tone softer now. I texted you instead," I admitted, holding up my phone. Greg gave a small smile, his features softening further. "Smart. Let's check on Caleb." We found Caleb still sound asleep, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded. Once Greg was certain the house was secure, he returned to the kitchen, cleaning up the mess the intruder had left. I stayed close, unable to shake the sense of vulnerability. "You handled that well," he said as I sat at the kitchen island, watching him. "Not everyone stays calm in a situation like that." "I didn't feel calm," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was terrified." Greg paused, turning to face me fully. "Fear isn't a weakness, Nora. It's what you do despite it that matters." His words lingered in the air between us, heavy with sincerity. I had always admired Greg's ability to take control, his unwavering confidence. He wasn't my father, he never tried to be, but he had stepped into that role effortlessly, offering stability when our lives felt like they were falling apart after my dad left. Tonight, though, I saw him in a different light. Vulnerable, yet protective. Human. As the hours passed and the adrenaline ebbed, Greg's presence became an anchor. We talked in low voices about the break-in, about Caleb's safety, and eventually about things that had nothing to do with the night's events. He told me stories from his college days, his voice rich with nostalgia, and I found myself laughing despite the tension that still lingered. "It's late," he said eventually, his tone gentle but firm. "You should get some rest." I nodded, standing from the stool, but as I turned to leave, I hesitated. "Greg? Thanks for everything tonight." He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that made my chest tighten. "Any time, Nora." I went back to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the night's events, the moments of fear, and the strange comfort I felt with Greg. Something about the way he had looked at me tonight lingered in my thoughts, confusing and undeniable. The days that followed were uneventful, yet I couldn't shake the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Greg and I shared fleeting glances, unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. It felt as though we had crossed an invisible line, though neither of us acknowledged it. One evening, after Caleb had gone to bed and my mom was still out with friends, I found Greg in the living room. He was reading, his posture relaxed, but his expression pensive. I hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Hey," I said softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of surprise. "Hey, what's up?" I sat down on the couch opposite him, my hands fidgeting in my lap. Just couldn't sleep. Greg set his book aside, leaning forward slightly. "Still shaken up from the break-in?" "A little," I lied. The truth was far more complicated. He studied me for a moment before gesturing to the empty space beside him. "Come here." I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I moved to sit beside him. His presence was calming, and yet it set every nerve in my body alight. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that felt both casual and deliberate. "You're safe, Nora," he said, his voice low. "I'll always make sure of that." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. And in that moment, I knew our dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The air between us grew heavier, every passing second amplifying the unspoken tension. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at Greg, yet I could feel his gaze, steady and unreadable, as though he was waiting for me to say something. Anything. Do you ever feel like... I started, my voice trembling slightly before I caught myself. I hesitated, unsure of how to finish the thought. "Feel like... what?" His voice was soft, coaxing. "Like some things change too quickly to make sense of them," I finally said. My words rushed but honest. Greg leaned back slightly, his expression contemplative. "Change is inevitable, Nora. It's how we respond to it that matters." He paused, his tone shifting into something more careful. "But some changes, they take time to process. You don't have to figure it all out at once." I nodded, my mind racing. The way he spoke, the gentle cadence of his voice, made me feel seen in a way I couldn't explain, and yet it only added to the swirling storm of emotions inside me. As the silence wrapped around us, I glanced at Greg's hand, still resting near mine on the couch. My fingers twitched, tempted to reach out, but I hesitated. What was I even thinking? He wasn't just anyone. He was my stepfather. Yet there was an undeniable pull, a gravity that made it impossible to ignore the space between us. Greg cleared his throat, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his tone light, almost teasing. I forced a laugh, trying to mask the turmoil inside me. "Just tired, I guess." He tilted his head, studying me with a small, knowing smile. "You've always been a terrible liar, Nora." My cheeks flushed. "I'm not lying," I protested, though my voice lacked conviction. He didn't push further, but the intensity of his gaze made me squirm. I needed to break the moment before it swallowed me whole. "Do you think we'll ever catch the guy who broke in?" I blurted, changing the subject abruptly. "Mm-hmm." Greg's expression softened and he leaned back, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "I hope so. But sometimes things like that take time. You just have to trust the process." I nodded, though my thoughts were far from the break-in. Trusting the process seemed impossible when I couldn't even trust my own feelings. "I think I'll head to bed," I said suddenly, standing up. Greg looked up at me, his brows furrowing slightly. "All right, sleep well, Nora." I nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the doorway. "If you ever need to talk, about anything. You know I'm here, right? I turned back to him, my heart tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. I know, thanks, Greg. The days stretched into weeks, and life settled back into its usual rhythm, or at least it seemed to for everyone else. For me, nothing felt normal anymore. The memory of that night, the tension that lingered in the air whenever Greg and I were alone, it was all-consuming. I started avoiding him, retreating to my room or finding excuses to stay out late with friends. But no matter how far I tried to run, I couldn't escape the thoughts that plagued me. One evening, I came home later than usual, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the TV in the living room. I peeked in to see Greg sitting on the couch, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes lighting up in recognition. "Hey, stranger," he said with a small smile. "Late night?" "Just out with friends," I replied, shrugging as I dropped my bag by the door. He gestured to the couch beside him. "Come sit. You've been avoiding me." I froze for a moment, caught off guard by his bluntness. "I haven't been avoiding you," I lied, though even I didn't sound convinced. Greg raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "Like I said, terrible liar." I sighed, giving in, and sat down at the far end of the couch, keeping a safe distance. He watched me for a moment before speaking again. "Is this about the break-in?" he asked, his tone gentle. "No," I said quickly, then hesitated. I mean, maybe a little." Greg set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Talk to me, Nora. Whatever it is, I want to help." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I looked at him, really looked at him, and the wall I had been building around myself started to crack. "It's not the break-in," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's everything." Greg's brows furrowed in concern, and he shifted closer, closing the distance between us. "Everything like what?" I hesitated, my heart pounding as I struggled to find the words. "Like how things feel different now." His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Different how?" I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as I forced myself to continue. "I don't know. It's just, ever since that night, I feel like I don't know where I stand anymore. With you. With myself." Greg was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching mine. "Nora, The sound of the front door opening cut him off, and we both jumped, startled. My mom's voice echoed through the house as she called out, "I'm home!" Greg leaned back, running a hand through his hair as he let out a breath. "We'll talk later," he said softly, his tone almost regretful. I nodded, my chest tight with unspoken words, and hurried to my room before my mom could see me. The days turned into weeks, and the tension between Greg and me only grew stronger. Every shared glance, every fleeting touch, felt loaded with meaning. Yet we danced around the unspoken feelings, neither of us brave enough to confront the truth. One evening, the breaking point came. My mom was away on a weekend trip with her friends, and Caleb was staying with a cousin. It was just Greg and me in the house, the silence between us almost deafening. I had been in my room, trying and failing to focus on my homework, when there was a knock on my door. "Come in," I called, my voice wavering slightly. Greg stepped inside, his expression serious. "We need to talk." I set my pen down, my heart pounding. About what?" He hesitated, closing the door behind him before taking a seat on the edge of my bed. "About this thing between us." Ugh, my breath caught. Greg, Let me finish, he said gently, his eyes locking onto mine. I don't know when it started, Nora. Maybe it was that night, or maybe it was building for a long time before that. But I can't ignore it anymore. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. It's not just you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel it too, but it's wrong, Greg. It's so wrong. He reached out, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I know, he said softly, but feelings don't just disappear because they're inconvenient. I can't change how I feel about you. Tears welled up in my eyes as I finally looked at him. What do we do? Oh, Greg sighed, his expression pained. I don't know, but I do know this. We can't keep pretending it's not there. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy fog. My mind raced with the implications of what he was saying, the lines we had already crossed in our hearts, if not in our actions. Maybe, I started, my voice trembling. Maybe we need to put some distance between us to figure out what this really is. Greg nodded slowly, though the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. If that's what you want. It's not what I want, I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, but it's what we need, for both of us. He stood, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer before he pulled away. You're right. I'll give you space. As he walked toward the door, my chest tightened with the urge to call him back, to tell him I had changed my mind. But I didn't. Instead, I watched him leave, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the silence. The next few months were a blur of avoidance and forced normalcy. Greg and I rarely spoke beyond the necessary pleasantries, and when we were in the same room, we kept our distance. It was painful, but it was necessary. Slowly, the intensity of my feelings began to fade, replaced by a bittersweet acceptance of what could never be. One day, Greg announced he had taken a job in another city. My mom was thrilled for him, but I knew the real reason he was leaving. He was giving us both the space we needed to move on. On the day he left, I found him in the living room, packing the last of his things. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Hey, I said softly. Hey, he replied, his voice equally quiet. I hesitated before stepping closer. I wanted to say thank you for everything. He smiled, a small wistful curve of his lips. You don't have to thank me, Nora. I do, I insisted. You've been there for me in ways I can't even explain. I'll never forget that. He nodded, his eyes shining with unspoken emotion. Take care of yourself, okay? You too, I said, my voice breaking slightly. And just like that, he was gone. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges of pain. As the years passed, I learned to look back on that chapter of my life with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Greg had been a part of my journey, a catalyst for growth in ways I hadn't understood at the time. I never saw him again, but his impact on my life remained. He taught me about courage, about facing the truth even when it's uncomfortable, and about letting go when it's the only way forward. And for that I'll always be grateful.